I'm Joshua Cooper, and welcome to Cooper Union, what's happening with human rights around our world on ThinkTech Live, broadcasting from our downtown studio in Honolulu, Hawaii, and Moana Nui Akea. Today, we'll be looking at Ukraine, making sense of a senseless war, a feminist foreign policy perspective on war, featuring Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin's latest book, War in Ukraine, provides insight into the international humanitarian law and human rights violations taking place over the past year and prior. Medea Benjamin untangles the web of war in Ukraine through a careful, informed, judicious study. And we really thank her because this book serves as a guide to understanding Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine, as well as crucially considering how people power can bring the terrible tragedy to an end. Medea, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, nice to be on with you, Josh.
Medea, you have such a career in social change and positive people power policy. Can you share with us what got you started? I know you're involved in high school, but you also have been an amazing advocate and author working with Global Exchange, where it's a people-centered exchange for peace, equality, and equity. Can you share a bit about that?
Yes, I helped to found the group Global Exchange because I realized in my own life as a very young woman that it was only going outside of my country that I learned more about my country. I remember my first experience traveling to Mexico and then to Central America, and people my age told me about my own government. They told me about the Foster brothers and the Dulles brothers and what they had done to overthrow democratically elected governments in Latin America. And they told me about the United Fruit Company and Dole that had taken land away from indigenous people who were once able to feed themselves and had been thrown into poverty as a result. So I learned a lot about my country by leaving my country. Of course, you don't have to do that. But in my case, I lived in a very sheltered place in suburban Long Island and didn't really get an opportunity to see the bigger picture about the inequalities in my own country and my own state and my own community until I left.
It's true. Travel does give you great perspective. And also, it is wonderful to meet people because so many people are so well read and have such rich life experiences to share with us, where sometimes we've been a little bit more sheltered. And I know they used to do amazing tours, but they also looked at the bigger issues of globalization and peace movements. Can you share a bit about that as well, with the role of multinational corporations, how those have impacted, and how that also feeds into the global war machine?
Yes, in my own experiences, for example, I went down to Mexico right after the Zapatista uprising in 1994, which was connected to the free trade agreement that was signed between the US, Mexico, and Canada that was designed for corporate interests. And what it meant is that the US corn that is grown on big commercial farms was exported to Mexico, destroying the lives of thousands and thousands of small indigenous farmers. So I realized how the trade policies of my government really affected people around the world, and particularly indigenous people who have been trying to hold on to their land, faced with this onslaught of both takeover of their land by large companies and competition coming from commercialized farms in the United States.
No, it's such a rich history when you look at the Zapatista movement. And of course, it goes all the way back to Las Casas being the first bishop of Chiapas. And then, of course, the latest with Marcos and the exciting work that he's doing, recognizing our word is a weapon, and to be able to bring words to be able to make a difference in people's consciousness.
Yes, that movement really brought a new level of consciousness to a lot of people, not only in the United States, but in Mexico itself, where the writings of Marcos and the others really highlighted the tremendous oppression of the indigenous people, both in places in the rural areas, as well as the difficulties they have in the big cities. So yes, the word is a weapon, and the Zapatistas were so good at using that.
Beyond words, I love your actions with Code Pink to sort of counter the endless war on terrorism, following in the footsteps of the decades of war against communism. Can you share why it was so important to come up with Code Pink to sort of break the barriers where people could see what's really happening and how we're losing our own civil liberties, as well as wasting valuable resources on more wars that then actually just impoverished us more, but didn't even help on a foreign policy perspective as well?
For young people that don't remember the years right after the 9/11 attack, George Bush was the president at that time, and he called for a color-coded alert system that had yellow is mellow, orange be a little more scared, red, really, really be scared. But of course, we were never told what we should do when we were scared. But it left people in this state of uncertainty and fear, and it really paved the way for the US to go into not only Afghanistan, but into Iraq that had nothing to do with 9/11, but it became in people's minds connected. And so Code Pink was a way to say there are other ways to deal with violence, which is to bring people to justice who attacked us, but not use those attacks as a justification for US invasion and occupation and even more violence. So we've been committed over these last 20 years to this mission of trying to stop the US from using militarism as a way to deal with conflict, to promote diplomacy, and also to change the way we use our resources from one that really feeds this bloated Pentagon budget instead of a budget that is invested in helping to solve people's needs in the United States and helping people around the world to get out of poverty and to deal with the climate crisis that affects us all.
Really good points. And really, Code Pink was creating really our own code to question and challenge, but also to break through the blind pursuit of violence and war without end. And as you did share, really look at economic, social, and cultural rights here in our own country. In your book, it was so powerful. I know it started out with the quote of war is a tragedy, a crime, and a defeat. And we're coming up on February 24th, the 1-year commemoration. And as you pointed out, Russia's invasion was illegal on many counts. It was not an act of self-defense, and it was certainly not authorized by the UN. And you also stated clearly under international law, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the UN Charter, the invasion was an illegal crime of aggression. But when we look at all the pain and everything that's gone on, you definitely pointed out that there's new ways that we can move forward to pursue peace and try to change the conditions that people on the ground are facing.
Well, yes, as we're coming up to this 1-year anniversary, it's a time to look back at the tragedy of this year, also to look back at the context that led to this war and what we can do to unravel this conflict. And the solutions are really quite clear because they've been put forward many times. This issue of Ukraine not being part of NATO, but being a neutral country, which means it wouldn't host foreign bases, it wouldn't host foreign military. And there are many examples, like Austria, for example, Switzerland, of neutral countries that have been quite successful in developing themselves without having military alliances. And of course, the Russians would have to leave and their troops leave Ukraine. And there are other countries that would have to guarantee that this would not happen again. The issues of the Donbass are issues that have to be dealt with about self-determination for the majority Russian speakers and ethnic Russians there, as well as the issue of Crimea. But these are issues that can be dealt with. There just has to be the will on all sides to move from the battlefield to the negotiating table.
And I really think it's a great point because you also pointed out when we looked at the book already by just July of last year, an astounding 5.5 million Ukrainians were new refugees or exiled. And there's about 7.7 million that were displaced inside, and 30% of Ukrainian people fleeing their homes. And then on the other side, though, the people in Russia have also been peaceful protesting with just blank signs. I think one of the most powerful statements was by future diplomats. And there was 1,000 students, faculty, and staff of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations that is affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, signing an open letter condemning those who preferred weapons to diplomacy. And that quote really jumped out to me, that many generations of future diplomats will have to rebuild the trust in Russia and the good relations with our neighbors that have been lost. So it is people on both sides being directly impacted, but both showing that they want peace.
Absolutely. You think of those millions of refugees that are living far from their homes and oftentimes had to leave their loved ones behind because the men of military age, all the way up to the age of 60, were not able to leave and were forcibly conscripted into the military. And so women and children had to leave, and oftentimes elderly people who were not didn't have the conditions to leave were left behind as well. So there's a desperate attempt of people to be able to go back to their homes. I think it's also important, Josh, to talk about the positive way in which the refugees were treated, because we often see the turning back of refugees, whether it's in Europe, refugees coming from Africa, many of them being killed at sea. We see the same thing of refugees trying to get into our country at the Mexican border. And yet the refugees from Ukraine were welcomed with open arms in Europe, and particularly in Poland, where people say that the Polish people should get a Nobel Peace Prize for the way that they welcomed the Ukrainians into their homes. And of course, here in the United States, there was even a special immigration line that was created just for the Ukrainians on the Mexico border. And while we decry the way that many refugees are treated from poorer countries and from non-white countries, we should look at the way that refugees have been treated, the Ukrainians, as an example of how to treat all refugees. And then you brought up the issue about people in Moscow who have been very courageous in standing up against this war. In the early days, there were a number of different open letters that were written to the president from people like those young Russians who were studying diplomacy. But there were all kinds of people from all walks of life who have courageously protested this war, others who have felt compelled to leave. And there's a big diaspora now of Russians who didn't want to be conscripted into the military either. There are women who have been organizing a women against the war inside Russia and outside. So there are many examples of hundreds of thousands of Russians who have stood up to oppose this war. And I think we should also say that on both sides, there are conscientious objectors who have not wanted to fight and who have faced prison terms, beatings, and all kinds of repercussions for their stand to not kill their brothers in Russia or Ukraine.
No, those are really good points. And it really reminds me as well of what you were sharing, that when you look at what is going on and what people are facing, many are still choosing peace instead of violence. And that it also highlights some of the major points that you were talking about of what else is not on the global agenda, what else is falling to the wayside. But I thought the one point that you brought up that was really powerful as well was when we look at the climate action's being sidelined, the wars derailing efforts to confront the climate crisis, and even worse is the disaster capitalism running rampant with record profits in these oil areas of economy when we really need a Green New Deal for the whole planet.
Well, right, there are two economic sectors that are really profiting from this war. One is the energy companies, particularly oil and gas, that have stepped in to try to replace the Russian energy that has been sanctioned, but was an important source of energy for all of Europe, particularly for Germany's manufacturing sector. And here we see in the United States new licenses being given out for exploration, production, and refining of dirty oil and for gas. And that has harmed our own communities here in Louisiana and in Texas that have already borne the brunt of these big dirty energy companies. And then we also have to recognize all the money that is being poured into this war in Ukraine over $110 billion so far just from the United States, where the world, particularly in the global south, are crying out for funds to be able to deal with the climate crisis. And the wealthier countries have committed to a fund of $100 billion a year. This goes back to 2010, but have never fulfilled that promise. And yet, when it comes to war, the money is suddenly there, and people don't have to scrape and get out and protest and say, you know, we need money, because it suddenly appears. But that is money that should be used for the climate crisis, both here at home and around the world.
And building on that, you're exactly correct. It was the Copenhagen Accord, and then follow up and reinforce in the Paris Agreement that said there would be 100 billion. And of course, it's always falling short at the Conference of Parties, UNFCCC sessions in November. But there, all of a sudden, 100 billion was produced. And I also think a really good point, going back to your earlier statement, the way that the refugees were handled is a model of how it should always be done. And it shouldn't just be an exception for Ukrainians, but there were a couple things that the UN and the international community did where you're like, this is how we should always do it, not just in these conditions and circumstances, and to kind of challenge the hypocrisy where one group gets in to the front of the line. But we need to have a global standard, according to the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, for everybody.
Yes, but also let's point out, Josh, that there were exceptions in the case of Ukraine, and those were people of color. Some of them were students from Africa. Others of them were people from Asia who were living in Ukraine. And we document in the book how sometimes they were not even let onto the trains and the buses to leave and go to Poland. There are even cases where there were hotels that were opened up for the refugees, and the people of color were not allowed to stay in them. In fact, there were African countries that had to send their own planes to pick up these refugees because of the ill treatment they were receiving, both at the Polish border and when they got into Poland.
And I remember as well the case of the parliamentarian as well as athlete that had that happen, because there still, of course, is, especially when you look at where people are going into with Hungary, Poland, racism as well. And we have to call that out and come up with international standards that are sanctioned already and created in international human rights law that aren't quite implemented as well. Another big issue is food sovereignty. And we really see food sovereignty being sacrificed as food scarcity is spreading and increasing. Can you share with us a bit of the importance of how this global food crisis is impacting people all around as it's not arriving in ports as well as on people's plates?
Yes, I mean, in some ways, it shows the lack of food sovereignty in so many places around the world that are dependent on outside sources of food. I'm originally a nutritionist, and we tried to stop many countries from becoming so dependent on wheat in countries that couldn't grow their own wheat. But yet you see around the world that there is this dependence on wheat in Northern Africa, in places throughout the Middle East. And so when the center for grain exports for the world, which was Ukraine and Russia, became areas of conflict, and that grain stopped getting out to the rest of the world, including the fertilizers that were coming from Russia, it really affected food prices all over the world, but especially in those countries in North Africa and the Middle East that were dependent on grain coming from the Ukraine and from Russia. And so one of the interesting things that maybe is an example of how Ukraine and Russia can be brought to the table to negotiate are the negotiations that happened around this grain deal to get millions of tons of grain out of Ukraine, to get the fertilizers out of Russia, to try to mitigate this crisis that was affecting so many parts of the world. And that grain deal has held. There was a moment where after the first 6 months of the deal, it looked like Russia was going to pull out because it wasn't, it said that, while the grain from Ukraine was getting out, the fertilizers from Russia were not getting out. that seemed to be solved, and the grain deal continues. So it is a good example of ways that diplomacy can work in the middle of war to help with the crisis that it was affecting so many hungry people.
It's true. The grain deal with the land and sea corridor helped to stop that shortage. And maybe that kind of leads to as well, what's the strength of a feminist foreign policy, and how can that also lead towards greater diplomacy?
Well, the feminist foreign policy is a really basic one of saying that we have to find ways to deal nonviolently with conflicts. And we see this we talk about the case of the grain deal, but there were also the effects of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, where the communities surrounding that plant were terrified that the shelling that both sides seemed to be doing was going to lead to an explosion. And there were many women in that area who came out and started demanding that there be a cordon sanitaire that was created around that plant to stop the shelling. And again, we have an example of this going into international mediation to allow the International Atomic Energy Association to come in and try to guarantee the safety of that plant. But these are the kinds of things that women's groups in the women in the community, as well as women on the international level, are calling for. Of course, what we're calling for is peace talks that will deal with all of the issues. But in the meantime, there's the grain deal, there's the deal to try to guarantee the safety of the nuclear plants. There are the deals to deal with the prisoner swaps, and also returning the bodies of soldiers who have been killed. There are so many mothers in Russia who have been demanding that their sons be returned. And so, that's another tragedy in this war, and efforts that have been made to create an agreement so that these bodies could be returned to their families for a proper burial and ceremonies.
I think that just summarizes it's really getting down to seeing the humanity in one another. And as you said, too often there's really been a great call, though, by Code Pink for money for the poor, not the war, and looking at how we can really redirect funds towards economic, social, and cultural rights to housing, healthcare, and education going forward. Maybe you can share what amount of funds is being spent on the war and how that could be put into domestic as well as even development assistance around the world.
Yeah, I think people have a hard time visualizing even what $1 billion is. And now we're talking about a Pentagon budget of $858 billion. And that's not including some of the parts of the military budget. For example, the energy department that deals with some of the nuclear issues and the modernization of these nuclear weapons. The Veterans Department. If you put all of these together, it's about $1 trillion now that the U.S. is spending every year, more than the next 9 countries' military combined. And there's a great project called the National Priorities Project that has a website where you can put in your city and your state and look at what is being spent on the military and what it could actually go for. And this really makes people more aware of the hundreds of thousands of jobs that could go for education, the amount of money that could go to green jobs, good green jobs, as part of a Green New Deal, the money that could go for infrastructure projects. And while that just deals with the domestic issues, we know from the money that we spent just on Ukraine, over $100 billion, that would go 3 times, I think, to feed the people of the world, right, Josh? Where it's estimated that $30 billion would be enough to feed people around the world. So it is important to think not only about the lives lost in Ukraine and other wars, about all of the refugees around the world, including from conflicts and climate refugees, and how people need to be taken care of in these conflict situations, as well as just all of the people that are dealing with the effects of the climate disaster and how we have to free up money from our Pentagon, from our war spending, to be put into people's needs, whether it's alleviating poverty or dealing with the climate crisis, or just providing for a decent healthcare system here in the United States, where we're one of the richest countries in the world with one of the worst healthcare systems.
Very true. And we could actually meet the entire 2030 agenda and actualize all 17 global goals inside the borders of the US, but also around the entire world. And of course, not even mentioning the nuclear apocalypse that we're at the sort of brink of as well. I really enjoyed the book. And the last quote that really stuck out to me was Russia pacifist Leo Tolstoy, of course, who used to write with Gandhi. And he said, in all history, there's no war that was not hatched by governments alone, independent of the interests of the people, for whom war is always pernicious, even when successful. And maybe you could just build on that as we close out.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful quote because it shows how governments, and of course, to that we should add the economic interests, a small section of the economy that benefits from these wars, and how in wartime, truth is always a victim, and the propaganda is so heavy on all sides. Today, we see it in Russia, in Ukraine, and we see it in our own country as well, where people are made to feel that giving more and more weapons is the way to lead to peace, that war leads to peace rather than peace leading to peace, negotiations leading to peace, diplomacy leading to peace. And so it's important to break through the fog of war, and here in the United States to convince our own people that we must stop looking at the tragedy in Ukraine as one that can be alleviated by more weapons, and instead convince our Congress and the White House that what's in the best interest of all the people in Ukraine, in the United States, in Russia, and around the world is to find a negotiated solution to this conflict as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Medea. And that really concludes, it brings up also a point for Mahatma Gandhi's vision of that where there is love, there is life. And we have to really have a new approach to foreign policy as well as our domestic affairs rooted in human rights and justice for all. Mahalo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nice to be on with you.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.